Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to welcome everyone here to this event to discuss a Marshall Plan blueprint for Ukraine. I'd like to thank the German Marshall Fund and the Association of Marshall Scholars for hosting us this morning. I personally have a sort of was an indirect beneficiary of the Marshall Plan, the original Marshall Plan. I had the privilege of studying for 2 years at Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. And the Marshall Scholarships were established by the British government after the Second World War to thank the United States for the Marshall Plan. So we have a great group of participants in our panel today to discuss Ukraine and Marshall Plan and Reconstruction. To my left is Her Excellency Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. Previously, she served as Ukraine's Minister of Finance and First Deputy Finance Minister. Prior to her public service career, Ambassador Markarova spent 17 years working in private equity and finance, and she holds a BS and MS degrees in environmental science from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine and an MPA in public finance from Indiana University. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
To her left, Heather Conley. Heather is the sixth president of the German Marshall Fund. Heather came to GMF after 12 years at CSIS, where she most recently served as Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and as Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program. She previously served 4 years as Executive Director of the Office of the Chairman of the Board at the American National Red Cross, and was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And then finally, David Ignatius. He's the associate editor and columnist for the Washington Post. He's also written 11 spy novels, including Body of Lies, great movie, which director Ridley Scott adapted into a film starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard, where he studied political theory and received a diploma in economics from King's College, Cambridge. And David's also a member of the Board of Trustees here at the German Marshall Fund. So welcome, David. Perhaps, Ambassador, I could start with you and ask a two-part question. One, perhaps if you could frame for us the current situation in Ukraine. The war, Bakhmut, obviously it's in the news. Where do you see things standing today? And then secondly, obviously we need to begin and continue reconstructing Ukraine now, but an important part of sort of reaching true reconstruction is an end to the war or a cessation of hostilities. What would victory look like for Ukraine from your perspective? So where are we today? What's your take on things? And then what do you see as the end game from a Ukrainian perspective?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The question can take me like an hour to answer, but since I really want to have the discussion here with such an exceptional panel, the situation is difficult. It has been difficult since Russia reinvaded us after 9 years of different types of wars, hot war in 2014, hybrid wars after that. But for over a year now, there has been constant fighting on the front, and the front has been pretty much everywhere. There has been shelling of Ukraine. There has been, more than right now 14 attacks by drones and missiles, and more than half of our energy system is destroyed. They're fighting not only in Bakhmut. I mean, Bakhmut is, of course, everyone talks about Bakhmut, but actually the front line is pretty long and it's very difficult. And we are literally fighting for every inch of Ukrainian land. The reason we do it, because we know what happens to Ukrainians behind that line. We all have seen Bucha, we all have seen Izium, we all have seen so many places, Kherson, where people are dying literally on a daily basis because Russians are still shooting all the time across the Dnipro. But we also know that people have been tortured, raped, children have been deported to Russia. So for us, the liberation is, of course, about the land, but it's also about saving lives. So it has been very difficult, but at the same time, the will to fight and our morale is still very strong. We have no other choice. We have no other option. All of us, from President Zelensky to the last soldier on the battlefield, have only one goal: to win. And as the previous year has shown, we can win. We already destroyed Putin's plan for a blitzkrieg. Remember, we were supposed to be completely taken over in 3 days, and then a week, and then whatever. We have liberated more than 50% of what Russians were able to occupy since February 24th. And with the right amount of weapons, with, of course, toughening of the sanctions, which clearly help to decrease the Russian capacity and capabilities to fight, with the help to Ukraine, we can win. Now, how that victory should look like? President Zelensky put it in the 10-step peace formula. So it's very complex picture, but at the same time, very simple. We have to restore our territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders, by the way, recognized by Russia too. So Crimea is Ukraine, just to answer if there are questions about that. We have to return all the people back, all Ukrainians, including those kept in Russia, including the children they have stolen and kidnapped from us. We have to start rebuilding, and we have to do everything possible all together to have justice, the full and comprehensive justice, meaning all the criminal cases in Ukraine. And we have now more than 73,000 individual criminal cases on war crimes and related to war crimes, all the 3 international courts, and hopefully tribunal for the crime of aggression itself. So just to finish with my initial answer, reconstruction. It's very important to talk about it now and do it now, not only because, like our European Union candidacy and everything else, it's a light at the end of the tunnel, but also because it already started now. So we do have 14 million Ukrainians who are internally or externally displaced, people who do not have any places to live anymore. That's why they relocated either within Ukraine or outside. We also know that the majority of people want to come back. And the polls that we did clearly says that there are 3 things that these people, mostly women with children, need in order to come back. They need jobs, they need secure schools with bomb shelters for the children, and they need housing. So we already, because the infrastructure is so severely damaged, we are doing what our president calls rapid recovery right now. It's very important that even what we do now is done in line with the plan, the master plan of the future renovation of Ukraine, which we plan to leapfrog. We plan to do something more innovative. We plan not only to restore what was destroyed, but actually build something much better, more efficient. So this is the time not only to talk about it, but prepare it, and already with the wartime insurances, which are becoming available, with the additional capital, that private capital and IFIs are ready to commit, actually start the projects right away.
Thank you, Ambassador. And also, I neglected to welcome our participants virtually. I think I understand we have over 600 people participating virtually, so welcome to everyone who's participating online. Heather, to follow up on the reconstruction question, and obviously this Marshall Plan is being discussed for Ukraine, is being elaborated. Perhaps you could just give us a bit of a history lesson in terms of the original Marshall Plan. What were the successful elements of that plan, and what lessons can be learned from what happened after the Second World War? And then also, I understand the German Marshall Fund has put out a detailed paper on a potential Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Perhaps summarize for us some of the key elements of that.
Well, John, thank you so much. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you to Rotary, how much Rotary has been doing to support the Ukrainian people through your grantees. So let me just thank you for your incredible work. The ambassador ended where I'm going to begin. The history of the Marshall Plan, and of course, the German Marshall Fund is the living memorial to the Marshall Plan. And we were a gift that was created 51 years ago almost, in gratitude for what the American people had done to restore the strength, the prosperity, and the hope of 16 European countries after the end of the Second World War. It is so vital that we plan now. Why? Because we have optimism and confidence that Ukraine will be victorious. The American people are builders. We build and we deliver hope. So planning for this reconstruction now, and it's already happening now, the Ukrainian people are already rebuilding. This is what we have to do and bring urgency. It is the essential pillar of winning the war, and this is securing the peace and rebuilding Ukraine back better. The second lesson of history is, and this is something that it's being challenged. I know David will talk a little bit about this. Strong American bipartisan support for supporting reconstruction of Europe. Not an easy task. Then, like now, we have strong isolationist voice in our country that said we've done our part. We need to build here at home. And strong Republican and Democratic voices crisscrossed this country in 1947 to explain what American interests were, why it was essential. It was not easy, but people were convinced, and they had skin in that game, literally. We had fought in the Second World War, and we were at risk of losing all of the gains, all of the objectives. So strong bipartisan American support. The Marshall Plan, the original Marshall Plan, it was led by the 16 recipient countries. Ukraine must lead its own recovery. The donor community cannot be a substitute for that. So this has to be driven by Ukraine. Transparency and reform is essential, from delivery of humanitarian assistance, which is the immediate needs, all the way to modernization and rebuilding. And so we have to be very cognizant that what we're providing today in assistance, we're not harming the Ukrainian private sector or markets in any way. We're supporting them. This is a really big issue. The underlying policy goal of the original Marshall Plan, what the United States government insisted, is that the 16 recipient countries 75 years ago become an integrated European market. This is why it is so vital for Ukraine to be a member of the European Union, to be a full participant in the European single market. Because as the then administrator of the Marshall Plan said, we're not reconstructing countries, we're creating markets. That's what we need to do. It was also time limited. It was only a 4-year program, and donor coordination was essential. And the US, of course, effort was led by a titan of the private sector, huge private sector growth. Now, what was missing from that original Marshall Plan was civil society, municipal city leaders. And that's what we're suggesting. A modern Marshall Plan has extraordinary engagement with civil society, city and municipal leaders. They have to be an active voice of rebuilding Ukraine. So we put together, in some ways, there's 4 building blocks, and we're working on all of those building blocks, but let me just go over them very briefly. Coordination architecture. We're working on that. The G7 has created a multilateral donor coordination platform. This is good, being led by the Ukrainian finance minister, I believe, and the EU and the US. But we don't have a role for the private sector. We don't have a role for civil society and cities. So we still need to continue to ideate that architecture. Financing. Tough. But we have some things we can do. Use of Russian assets. There is not agreement yet. Canadian government has a law. Congress is proposing some things. We have to get agreement on that. War insurance. We have to protect that investment that needs to be coming. War bonds, patriotic bonds. How do we encourage that investment? How do we support international financial institutions, capitalization? And then how do we get the great American and European private sector to work with the great Ukrainian private sector, which needs help? And I've been talking with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and others. There's American companies that are very excited about being part of this. Third building block, accountability and rule of law. Accountability, of course, obviously means transparency and accountability for fighting corruption, something that lives within all of our societies. Strong rule of law, powerful democratic governance structures. But the accountability door is also about war crimes and accountability. And again, civil society plays a huge role in that. And finally, sustainability and integration. This has to be a sustainable recovery, environmentally, using best practices, the digital revolution. Ukraine's reconstruction is the most exciting building project in Europe. Let's be a part of it, and let's make sure that Ukraine is integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community as soon as possible. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Heather. Both the ambassador and Heather talked about the importance of continued support for Ukraine. David, perhaps if you could just give us a sense of your take on how strong is the Western coalition? How do you see continued support? Do you see cracks in that coalition? What more should the West be doing to support Ukraine? And then finally, China has now entered into the picture as a potentially important player in this process, with reports that China may be providing arms to Russia, et cetera. How do you evaluate the Chinese role in the current conflict?
So it's really wonderful to be here, especially with the Ukrainian ambassador, who we all admire so much for what she does. Just a personal note to begin as we talk about the Marshall Plan. As Heather knows, my father, who's now 102, was in Harvard Yard the day that General Marshall made his famous speech. And we were at an event last year celebrating the 75th anniversary. And my father said, as most people who were there would say, nobody quite knew how important this was. They just didn't see the fundamental world-altering character of what he was proposing. And I think the reason the Marshall Plan was so powerful was that the United States worked so closely with the countries of Europe, first. And second, thanks to wise and in the end bipartisan leadership, the United States was united in making this effort to rebuild a shattered Europe. And those are the reasons that it worked. So those same two factors obviously are central today. I'll give my own brief assessment. I think President Biden has done extremely well in keeping the international coalition together. The bet that President Putin made was that the West was weak, that Biden was a weak leader himself, that the Western alliance, NATO, was fractured. Only a few years before, French President Macron called it brain dead. He was thinking that if it's hit hard, this alliance will splinter. And that didn't happen because of very, very aggressive, attentive diplomatic work that continues to this day. And it's something that I think we ought to examine because it's a kind of case study in alliance management. So I think despite fears that Europe wouldn't get through this cold winter, turned out not to be so cold, thank goodness, but that European energy dependence on Russia would be a key factor. That hasn't happened. And although you can see some small differences among European countries, everybody wants to be together in the assertion, we stand with Ukraine. We want to give Ukraine what it takes to have an acceptable settlement. We'll call it victory, but we're still thinking, what exactly does that mean? I think President Biden has generally done well in trying to build bipartisan support at home. But I think right now that's a more difficult task for him. And the difficulty was dramatized yesterday when Ron DeSantis, a likely challenger, arguably the strongest emerging challenger on the Republican side, said that he doesn't think that supporting Ukraine is a vital interest for the United States. And I think as shocking as that may be for some people, that sets up the question appropriately. The United States is going to need to have a debate really next year in our election year about whether this is a vital interest. And President Biden, or whoever the Democratic candidate is going to have to make that case to the American people in terms of building steady long-term support. Ambassador, my own sense is that Ukraine has a year to work with where it can count on continued American support. I don't see significant cracks. I hear Ron DeSantis, a prospective presidential candidate, beginning to raise this as an issue, but I don't see in Congress, beyond a relatively small group centered in the House, significant Republican support. If anything, what I hear from Republicans is do more. Why don't you give more weapons to Ukraine? So for the moment, I think your country can count on and should understand that it can count on a year of American support. What the weapons should be, whether we should be thinking about F-16s and other more advanced weapons is going to be part of the debate about what our vital interests are. Just to say a brief word about Europe and then about China. So I think as we consider this question of reconstruction, Europe's role, and especially the role of the European Union, is absolutely central. In a way, this war is about Ukraine's fight to have a European identity. That desire has been more and more clear in the last 20 years, and Ukrainians are willing to fight and die to achieve that independence and ultimately, I hope, European identity. I hope that Europe will step up to that and find a way for Europe, for Ukraine to have some kind of accelerated process of consideration and ultimately admission into the European Union. There's a way to go. The issue of corruption in Ukraine worries Europeans, I'm sure worries Ukrainians. So addressing that aggressively, so the whole world can see, is in your interests and would speed up the process. One of the interesting things about China is that China wants to be increasingly involved, it seems, in the Ukraine story, and your President Zelensky seems to want to maintain an open channel with China. I've been struck by how interested he is in the Chinese dimension of this, and it's likely in the next week or so we're going to see the Xi-Zelensky engagement of some kind. I'd be very interested in your thoughts, Ambassador, about what that might lead to. On the central issue of whether China is prepared to supply Russia with weapons, if you read the Director of National Intelligence threat assessment testimony last week, you'll see that she said, Avril Haines said, that although China will continue to support Russia with money, technology, political support, that China will want to keep that support as private as possible, will not want to publicly, and the implication was directly militarily support Russia. I hope that remains true. It seems to me that the United States and its allies are making clear that if China changes that, there'll be significant penalties for China. So I'll end it there with just the final thought that war is about will, about the will to succeed. Ukraine is displaying it in a magnificent way, and I hope the United States will show the will to understand that its interests are engaged here, that we can't afford to see Ukraine lose any more than Ukraine can afford itself to lose. And as long as we have that clearly in our minds, I think the debate will come out fine.
If I could just follow up on that last point, what's the elevator pitch to a normal American? Why is it in the U.S. strategic interest and long-term interest and national interest to support Ukraine? Give me your elevator speech.
The elevator, in a one long sentence, this war was an illegal, unjustified invasion of another country that, if allowed to stand, will rupture the security balance in Europe, which is central to United States interests, not simply by the NATO treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, but by any measure of the kind of world that we want to live in. It's an event that, if it stands, if Russia succeeds, we'll all live in a different world, period. So, okay, that's the elevator speech.
Thank you. So, Ambassador, if I could just follow up on the corruption question, which both Heather and David talked about. Obviously, corruption was still an ongoing issue in Ukraine prior to the war. The Zelensky administration had been taking steps to deal with it. But if we're really serious about reconstruction, of all the money that's going to be poured in from governments, and of course, in trying to incentivize the private sector to come in, which is really the action is, right? That's where the bulk of the money will come from. Corruption, rule of law, transparency, all that's going to play an increasingly important role. What is the government doing? What will the government be doing to address this issue? And particularly, what will you be doing to sort of leverage this reconstruction money to finally deal with the systemic corruption issues that Ukraine has been facing really since independence in '91? And then secondly, a follow-up to David's point on China. What's your take on the Chinese situation and the upcoming perhaps conversations that President Zelensky will be having with the Chinese leadership?
Well, let me start with the fight with corruption that we have been very successfully holding for the past 9 years. And let me disagree that we do have a systemic corruption. When I came to the government in 2014, the country was robbed blind by the Russian or pro-Russian regimes before. And yes, the corruption was systemic and the fight with corruption was sporadic. I would say the situation is completely changed now through a number of actions, a number of reform governments took since 2014. First, we have tackled the very sources of corruption. The gas, something where, we deregulated the prices, we demonopolized the market, we took out all the intermediaries that were there between Ukraine and Russia before 2014. And that was the source of, the majority of the, as we call the president's corruption before 2013. Second, the procurement. It was another big part where there was systemic corruption in Ukraine, but with the introduction of ProZorro, and I want to say that it was not a conditionality in any of the programs, international programs, it was Ukrainian idea, which was implemented, and all the procurement was not only became public, but it was also taken online. So digitalization that was starting to be widespread in the government services. Third is the public finance openness. Something that I did personally, my pet project, which became a very interesting institutionalized idea where in Ukraine, you can see all the expenditures and all the revenues online the next day after they are done. So we have, I would argue, one of the most transparent public finance systems, which was a little bit curbed, and closed during the recent war and reinvasion or after reinvasion of Russia. But, everything is very public, and the civil society, which has been a driving force behind also all these changes, can also see and really hold the government accountable. Decentralization reform, again, one of the reforms which is pure Ukrainian reform, was not a conditionality on any of the IFI programs, has created very capable local governments, has given incentives to local governments, because we are not only given the real estate and property taxes to the local authorities, but also the part of the corporate income tax and personal income tax. So every job created in a village benefits people in that village. Every international company brought to work in some regions actually deliver to the people as soon as it starts working. So, and I can go on and on, but we decreased the space for corruption, very, very much even before this reinvasion started. On top of it, we have created a full new infrastructure, which again, not a lot of countries have, with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, special anti-corruption prosecutors, and the National Anti-Corruption Court. Now, we already are into the second heads of both institutions. The Anti-Corruption Court is reviewing the cases. Of course, there will be criticism. Of course, there will be mistakes, but this is how the rule of law evolves in any country. Now, rule of law is even bigger problem to tackle, which we also started doing. And by the way, we don't talk probably a lot about it. We should talk more. That during this war, during all year of the full-fledged war, we continued the judicial reform. The highest council of justice, couple of people, a friend of mine who's the Supreme Court justice, volunteered to the front lines, fought on the front lines, was recalled from the front lines because he needed to participate in the selection of in these new reforms. It's going on as we fight. Now, is everything perfect? Definitely not. But the President Zelensky made it very clear, not only when he was elected, but recently when we saw some allegations, that there is zero tolerance to that we will act swiftly, even firing people. And maybe we will have to say we are sorry, at some point, because then the justice system has to investigate and review, but we are very serious about it. And plus the 3 inspectors general who just recently visited Ukraine, who are doing their work from here, or, I see the flow of documents between the 2 countries. It's very extensive, have been very clear about the fact that even, whatever allegations was there, it was never about the American money. It was never about any help actually the foreign partners provided to us. And there are no proofs of any type of mismanagement. Now, we are doing it, and I just want to finish with that, not because our international partners want it, not because, but because Ukrainian people demand it. And during this war, to engage in corruption is probably the highest level of treason. When people are given their lives for the country, this is not something Ukrainians will tolerate. So from president to, again, everyone, we are very set on this. Now, there are aspects of that fight which are very important, where we actually need help and support from our European colleagues and from the US. De-oligarchization. Ukraine is at the front now of the de-oligarchization and fight with that. We actually have the transparent registry of the beneficial owners, something that is not available in the majority of countries. And now when we suspect that some of the assets are either owned by Russians or oligarchs or Russian-related oligarchs, we see that it's some kind of offshore companies somewhere in other countries, but it's transparent in Ukraine. It's not transparent in other countries. So we need a better cooperation in order to be able to hold them accountable. Sanctions. Right now, we already sanctioned more oligarchs and individuals than some of our partners. And we're asking them to really carefully look at all the sanctions and, if possible, accelerate the sanctioning. Because when people who are either robbing Ukraine or cooperating with Russians or stealing something from Ukrainians and helping Russians, but then they can, be the owners of the places in the theaters or donators to some of the think tanks or live good lives outside of Ukraine and Russia. This is also not fair. And this is the help that we need in order to be able, so it will take a village to actually help us to do what President Zelensky really wants to do in the fight with corruption and de-oligarchization, because the oligarchic structure and the capture of some portion of the industries is probably the last area where we need to clearly resolve it in order to have the fair competition. This is what business, Ukrainian and international, and by the way, international business that works in Ukraine, we think it's Ukrainian business. And a number of them, you were talking about, doing something now. Westinghouse, Boeing are increasing their presence right now during the wartime. A number of agricultural companies that worked in Ukraine before the war are doing it. DFC has done a project in Ukraine, the new one last year with the banking institution. We just need, the more compliant businesses we will have, the faster we will be able to fight with the remains of the corruption and create this free and very transparent space. And that leads to another question, because this funding and private business participation in it is very important. Because I remember, again, it's been a long time since I talked about the pre-war situation, and this is something that I like to talk about it. But when we introduced a very transparent, according to the international standards, privatization laws and rules, and also the product sharing agreement introduced in Ukraine, and we started doing the first competitions, guess how many Western companies came to participate in these competitions? 0. It was only Ukrainian oligarchs or sometimes Chinese companies. So I'm like leading to you. So it's, there is a saying in Ukraine to put your money where your mouth is. I think a lot of reforms would be much more successful. That's why the decentralization reforms is successful. When it's also paired with the financing, when the practices are actually compliant and transparent. So that's why talking about reconstruction is now, and about supplying or helping those American companies that would like to come right now and see themselves expanding after we win in this war is very important. Now, on China or anyone else, clearly the situation in Ukraine is very black and white. It's a brutal violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty. Of course, every time Ukrainians said no to the Russian government in Ukraine, and it was during the Orange Revolution and during the Revolution of Dignity, it's when either our democracy was threatened, when the election results have been stolen, or when the European future was under the risk of taken away from us. So for us, clearly, I mean, there were a number of problems before 2013 in other areas, but what gets Ukrainians to act is democracy, freedom, and independence. This is something that we cannot live without. Now, it's clear that for the US, for European Union, for all democratic countries, this is more than just about the sovereignty and territorial integrity. But if we talk more broadly, and if we talk about China, and Chinese government always says how sacred the UN statute and territorial integrity and sovereignty is for them, of course, we will reach out and we will explain to everyone why in this moment in history, they have to support not Ukraine, but their own principles and standards that they have been publicly declaring. Similar with our colleagues in South America, in Africa. I'm also representing Ukraine to the Organization of American States, and the support there of the members was also great, because they understand that this is our anti-colonial war, and if Russia is allowed to, without provocation, without justification, with no reasons but their own imperial reasons, to attack a peaceful neighboring country, then the implications for all members of the UN are huge. So yes, we will engage with everyone. We will engage with anyone who would talk to us to explain not only our side of the story, but share the truth. And we will ask everyone, and we already have 141 countries who voted for the resolution at the United Nations, but we will ask everyone to support their own position on the UN Charter and send a clear message to Russia that they have to stop.
Well, Heather, in your opening comments, you talked about the fact that the original Marshall Plan didn't effectively incorporate civil society and the private sector into this process, and just sort of following on to the ambassador's comments on reconstruction and the importance of the private sector. What do you think needs concretely to be in place in the new Marshall Plan for Ukraine to bring that civil society and private sector participation into play?
Well, John, thank you. And I have to say, Oksana, I love watching you get your eyes light up about reform and transparency. That is such a better conversation to talk about than Bakhmut. So that's where we want to restore this conversation, rebuilding Ukraine. And exactly as you said, civil society, city leaders, municipal leaders play a key role in everything, Oksana, that you talked about, corruption. This is a war of independence against that system. And you feel it very clearly that the old is not acceptable anymore. It is treason. And I think from society, from the bottom up to the top down, and government, I think sometimes we too often cling on to narratives that are no longer true because of the digitalization. Some of these transparency measures we should bring here and to other European capitals. We're not as far ahead on ultimate beneficial ownership, the transparency that we need in money laundering. That infects our system as well. So I think equally we need to be more transparent. What we can do, John, we really actually have the next couple of months are really important. And it's building towards a very important conference that will be held in London on June the 21st and 22nd, the Ukraine Recovery Conference. The reason this is important is because, these are my words, the international community has sort of been throat clearing a little bit about, we need to do something, not sure what we need to do. We know we've got to get started. So we've had some throat clearing, very good conversations, very important discussions, but now decisions need to be made. And this is where I think this London conference becomes incredibly important. Number one, the private sector has to be integral to this reconstruction, and they don't have a way in. right now. They're talking to the Ukrainian government, obviously, but the donor community needs to be part of that. Civil society has to be at that reconstruction table. They're still knocking on the door. They're not there yet, and city leaders as well. So we need to make sure that coordination table is integrated. We need to make sure it has priorities for what we are focusing on in this current phase. And we need to get the financing working now. So use of Russian assets, war insurance, war bonds, I would put that in the priority category. We've got to come out of the London conference with concrete measures so we can now begin, and it's already happening, to begin to rebuild Ukraine. It's essential. If we miss this window, and again, we have a couple of confluence of factors here. The counteroffensive will be beginning. We have to keep giving the Ukrainian people hope that a better tomorrow is there. We've got to keep driving that the best policy answer to Vladimir Putin is a rebuilt Ukraine. But we have to do it, and tough decisions have to be made, and politics need to be managed. We need to be doing much more elevator pitches to the American people. On Sunday, my church, we prayed for the Ukrainian people. Rotarians are active, civic groups are active, cities are active. I think the American people are active. I want our political leaders to reflect that activism and that solidarity, because we know we need to reinforce it, and we need to make that clear what's at stake here for sure.
Thank you, Heather. David, one last question, perhaps, before we turn to the audience for questions. Maybe stepping back 30,000-foot level. You've written a lot about this. What is how do you see the world post Ukraine war? How has Ukraine, the war, changed the world? What's going to, obviously been a lot of short-term changes. What do you see as the medium and long-term effects of this war?
I'm so glad you got that question, David.
So obviously that depends on how it ends. If this war ends with a repudiation, a defeat of Putin's aggression, President Biden says that will come through a negotiated settlement, not an unconditional surrender by Putin, and I think that's probably right. But if it ends with the failure of that project, then I think the prospects for a rules-based order, for a successful Ukraine, a successful, powerful Ukraine, Europe that's rediscovered its identity. I almost want to say rediscovered its soul in supporting Ukraine. Strong demonstration of United States willingness to work with partners to prevent aggression having an effect on China's decisions about Taiwan. Many positive things flow from that. So other aspects of what the world's going to look like. We're going to have a weaker Russia, no matter exactly how this ends. Putin badly miscalculated, is overreached. And you have a situation now where his generals are publicly feuding with oligarchs. I'm told the situation in Russia is as messy as it looks. So this is going to be a weaker Russia. It will be a Russia that's more subject to Chinese hegemony. So we're going to have, I sometimes wonder if we're going to talk more about Eurasia as the kind of organizing construct, not the particular countries, China and Russia, but a Chinese-dominated Eurasia. I think that if there's a settlement of this war that's solid and reliable, so that companies feel comfortable investing, you're going to have a boom in post-war Ukraine. I mean a boom. The volume of reconstruction that's going to be necessary is in the trillions of dollars. It's an enormous amount of money. One reason, Ambassador, I worry about corruption is when there's that much money sluicing through a system, the temptations are overwhelming. But I trust that you're going to handle that wisely. But I think that Ukraine is going to have the strongest military in Europe. We don't think about that much, but Ukraine's military capabilities after this war will be enormous. How's that absorbed? Ukraine probably won't be a member of NATO, certainly not initially. How's that going to work? What's going to happen in Russia? Is Russia going to fragment? in ways that are dangerous for Russians, for Americans, for the world. I don't want to see a Russia that splinters apart. I don't think that's in your interest. I've heard Ukrainians say it is. I don't believe it. So I think those are the difficult questions as we look at, but everything begins with the resolve of the next year or two to see this through to an acceptable outcome. Not an unconditional surrender by Putin, but an acceptable outcome in which Putin's war effort is rebuffed and defeated. And then you build a pretty good world after that.
Thank you, David. We have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. If you could please state your name and your affiliation. Yes, sir. Brent, good to see you. What is the U.S. government? The question was for those virtually listening. What should the U.S. government be doing to prepare for reconstruction?
Well, I'm happy to jump in and then let other colleagues. I mean, I think right now the U.S. government has certainly stepped forward under the G7 to create this coordination platform, but we need to now put our resources again. A very senior level U.S. official, I think someone who is going to be able to crisscross the country just as George Marshall did and many of the senior figures in the Truman administration to exactly do that important public diplomacy to build support for that. But as I said, I think it's now making sure that U.S. companies who are already starting have the financing, the insurance, we're enabling them to help rebuild, that we're supporting civil society, that we're supporting the priorities that the Ukrainian government is setting. The thing I think for a U.S. audience is that unlike the Marshall Plan, where it was one U.S. donor, the United States, providing aid to 16 countries, our European partners, our Indo-Pacific partners are supporting Ukraine's reconstruction as well. That's why the coordination is so important. So it's not just the U.S. that would be so-called shouldering this burden, but it's not a burden. It is rebuilding and creating new markets for Ukraine, for the US, and for Europe. So, but we have to organize now. And that's why we certainly have been encouraging policy leaders to start making those plans now. And I said, I think American philanthropy, American citizens, American companies are eager to get to this place. They need help and support and direction, how the government is supporting them, how multilaterals are supporting them, and then prioritizing so we don't duplicate and making sure we have those strong transparency systems in place.
Well, let me say first what the U.S. government is already doing, and we value it a lot. First, the Ramstein Coordination Group, which soon is going to be a year since it started. People think it's only about weapons, and what we need on the battlefield now, but actually it's a very coordinated, led by Secretary Austin personally. He never missed a meeting himself. Not only on what is the capabilities that needed on the battlefront, but also a coordination group of a number of, future development, how not only we win now, but also build an endurance strength for the future. And it's very much related to reconstruction as well. The energy coordination platform, which already has been very active, Department of State and Department of Energy are both taking a lead there. Ambassador Pyatt has been on the Zoom and phone literally on the daily basis. It is about reconstruction a lot. And the issues we discuss there is not only, what transformers and how many do we need in order to put the energy back after the attacks, but also about, we're discussing the new concept of the decentralized energy system. We're talking with the companies, with the IFIs. It's not only G7 there, but all the IFIs actually about how to move from where we are now, not to where we need to be tomorrow, but also how it's going to look for the future reconstruction, the energy. This platform, which just started, there are initial discussions. We have Lugano principles, where transparency and the participation of the society is there. We are discussing it now, how to organize it, but it's very important and it's more complex than just energy or other parts. Now, what is needed? I think if we can speed up the decision making on the use of the Russian assets, both sovereign and private. On the private, thanks to the amendment by Senator Graham, which was included in the omnibus, and the first 5.4 million have already been confiscated by the DOJ and given to the Department of State. There is a clear route what to do with the confiscations of the private oligarchic assets, which could be used for Ukraine. Now we have to work on how the infrastructure of how to then use it in Ukraine, again, in a very effective, transparent process according to the priorities. But the sovereign assets, this is the question number one. This is a clear act of aggression. This is a war of aggression. That is a crime of aggression. So I know there are a lot of, as the former Minister of Finance, there are a lot of sensitive issues there. But I think it's such a clear case that is separate from anything else, that all the countries, and there are a number of them, including the US, that do have the sovereign assets, frozen at the moment of the Russian Central Bank and the Russian National Wealth Fund, that this asset should be not only frozen, but seized and confiscated. And that should be what we will use in order to rebuild Ukraine. So if we can move faster there, if we can move faster with the tribunal, if we can move faster with sanctions and isolation of Russia, we can faster get to just and enduring peace, which will allow the reconstruction, the major reconstruction, to start faster. And of course, more weapons. This is, I'm sorry, but I have to say it. The weapons is the most needed humanitarian assistance right now, because this is what allows us to save people. So the more capabilities that we can gets us closer to the victory and to peace.
I'm Dave.
This is a
Rolla.
microphone.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, there you go. I'm Dave Rolla, German Marshall. I'm sorry, the George C. Marshall Foundation, not the German Marshall Fund. I was a fellow there here, but now with the George Marshall Foundation in Lexington. I want to follow up on that because I'm a lawyer by trade or by profession. Who in the government or elsewhere is really working on this? The real mother lode of money is the central bank, $300 billion that is sitting in escrow, and international law and our own laws, I think, prohibit us just grabbing onto that and using it. So what's the state of real progress in coming up with a solution on that? Because we can get at it. I suppose there must be a pathway, but I'd like to hear, is there an individual? Is there a group? Is the Department of Justice really looking at this in a serious way?
My government or your government? American
I
government.
think he's asking about
right?
the American government.
So first, of course, it's Treasury, and Secretary Yellen is working a lot on this. There is the intergovernmental cooperation. So there are groups like Klepto Capture, where it's the Treasury, Department of State, and DOJ are involved together. Of course, the White House is involved in this discussion. So there is a very active discussions at the moment on both, the private and the sovereign assets, which you referred to. Now, we probably will not be able to do it without active participation of lawmakers. So Congress is discussing that already. We have a number of senators and people in the House that are discussing it. It's where, the finance expertise needs to meet the legal expertise and a political will and readiness to think a little bit outside of the box in order to be able to find the solution there, but it can be found.
Could just follow up on that. I mean, if they came up with a pathway that really looked like it would succeed, wouldn't that be some leverage to bring the the Russians to the table?
Well, I don't know about bringing them to the table. The intent, Putin and Russian intent to destroy Ukraine, which has been there for the past 400 years, which has been there after they attacked us after 3 years of independence in 1918, when they did Holodomor, when they sent so many millions of Ukrainians to Gulag, when they, right after we regained our independence in 1991, started systemically working against Ukraine, systemically trying to infiltrate Ukraine, paying enormous amount of actually energy and money for trying to implode the country from within. So the intent to destroy us is there. So I don't, like any war requires intent, capabilities, and window of opportunity. Well, clearly, Putin and his team thought they had it last year. It was a mistake, but in order to be able to negotiate, they need to have a will to negotiate and don't have it. So we need to deny them the capacity to complete their task in order for them to realize it's not possible. And that, of course, again, as I said, a function of weapons and support to us, but also the sanctions and isolation, and also this taking away the resources that are there from Russia, plus justice. I think the Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression will be a resounding message, not only to Putin, but to those who are voting all the time and approving these decisions to essentially permit war crimes in Ukraine.
We're coming toward the end of the hour. We start a few minutes late, so perhaps we go over a few minutes, take a few more questions. Yes, sir. They'll bring the microphone.
Thank you. Pat Sweeney, Department of Commerce. Agriculture is such an important part of Ukraine's economy, and Ukrainian agriculture is so important around the world. And it's been damaged, it sounds like, greatly, particularly in the eastern wheat growing parts of the country. As Ukraine and others prepare for reconstruction, how do you see bringing life back to the ag sector, whether it's fields, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera? What is that? What would that look like? Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. First of all, thank you to Secretary Raimondo and all the department for exceptional work and the latest export controls and import duties, and everything that is done by the department has been a big help, and really, justice that has been done. Rightfully so, about 5 million hectares of agricultural land in Ukraine cannot be used right now because it's either in the combat-related active war zones or because it's mined. Ukraine is a mostly mined country in the world right now, with the mines, but also unexploded ordnance and all the munitions and the missiles on the fields. Now, we have done the planting and the harvesting last year, even under the bullets. We're doing it now, of course, at a more difficult situation. But this is where the majority of priorities for the rapid recovery and reconstruction lies for Ukraine. First, demining as much as we can do, as fast as we can do. The standard in the industry is 1 month of war is a year of demining. We cannot afford that. We need to do it faster. We need to get everyone and all the expertise and all the innovations. And by the way, we're working with a number of companies in the US and globally to see whether we can do it in a different way, in a more innovative way. But also, it's not only important for Ukraine. This is the agriculture as well as energy and digitalization and IT sector is where Ukraine can be an answer to so many global challenges. In agriculture, we can not only come back to the pre-war level of production, but this is one of the areas for leapfrogging. This is where we can triple, 5 times, 10 times increase the production with the right equipment and financial resources and innovations, and the productivity gain in that sector can be huge. So we can not only, we can feed the world, literally. So this is where I think, the majority of American companies that work in Ukraine since early 90s, all the Cargill, Bunge, ADM and others, they are actively working. Their teams are on the ground as we speak. They are thinking about, starting this season, but also Ukrainian farmers, the small, medium-sized family businesses, they're all there. So whatever support that can be provided to agricultural sector is going to be not only, beneficial and efficient for Ukraine. But this is where more businesses, global businesses, can thrive, and this is where the local communities, because this is, again, Ukrainians are the bread growers. We now everyone knows we can fight, but we really like to grow food and raise children. This is our key specialty, and do startups. That's the recent addition. So this is one of the key sectors for the reconstruction.
Perhaps we'll take one more question before I ask our panelists each to make a final statement. Yes, sir. They'll bring the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Arthur Pishatowski, and I'm a sociologist, and I look more from the macro perspective in terms of the things which are taking place. And I think the ambassador mentioned that the Ukraine can answer some of Western democracy challenges. And there was also the earlier question about how is the global environment to be impacted by all of this? How are we changing in terms of the United States? And just some things that one could notice is more efficiency, more truth, more values, a clear example of right and wrong taking place. And going throughout America, a civilization where across the board, no matter what your political background is, you see people in full support in rural areas and urban areas, just an extreme amount of a type of passion for democracy in some way shaping itself in our society. I guess that's where my question is by those people who are leaders in this society, how is this being used? How is this format, this event, this global event, how is it reshaping our American democracy and the need for these internal conversations which we need, right? How do we mobilize this effort?
Heather, you want to take a crack at it, and then maybe David?
Well, why don't we? That's a nice one to maybe weave in as you go down the line. So can we start with David on that?
So a couple of moments that stick in my mind as I think about the moral and sociological dimensions of what we're watching. One is traveling with General Milley in the early weeks of the war through all of the frontline states. And you couldn't travel in Poland, Estonia, Latvia without seeing Ukrainian flags flying. And it was a galvanizing moment for Europeans. And I think it continues. I think the transformation for young Germans, for Polish society as a whole, is enormous. Ukraine is living the values that they espouse and reanimating them in the 21st century. Second moment that was very powerful for me was seeing President Biden travel to Kyiv. An American president going into an active war zone where his security couldn't be controlled. I thought that was a moment that was defining for him, and I hope, despite all our partisan politics, people understood how important it was. Final comment that I want to make as we close our conversation is how urgent these issues are. This year is going to be decisive in this war. And it's just not acceptable that that the ambassador should say, we still need weapons. We need an urgent life or death mobilization of the so-called arsenal of democracy, our ability to make it and deliver weapons to Ukraine while there's time for Ukraine to push back the overwhelming waves of Russians who are trying to take Ukraine down. It's urgent. So I just want to close my comments with that.
Well, and I'll just, if we're moving down the line here, John, I would just say this is a moment of great clarity. It is a moment of great clarity for the international system, for the United Nations Charter, for the international system that was built in the post-World War II environment. It is a moment of moral clarity as well. And so to come circle around to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking, and American political leaders are talking about what is in America's interest. Is this in America's interest? This is the moment for that clarity of if you believe in freedom, the dignity of the individual, sovereignty, territorial integrity, then this is in our interest to support Ukraine, to see an international system that complies with our values and principles, not the international system that is being shaped and sought very much under China's vision of the global security initiative and the Kremlin's vision of that. So it is a time of great clarity. And I think our history tells us, even in the run up to the Second World War, that clarity was very slow, too slow in coming. It can't be that slow in coming again. And we have, our history tells us, the Marshall Plan, that we can be part of something great. After winning the war, we secure the peace and we rebuild. And America's greatest allies today that are part of this effort are those that we helped recover from the Second World War. So we have history as our guide. It's powerful, but this requires clarity, leadership, and understanding what is at stake. And I would love to see greater urgency as we describe that to the American people, to Europeans, because the Ukrainian people are giving us a daily lesson in that clarity. I hope we absorb that lesson a little bit more quickly.
Well, I can probably give a number of reasons why I think it's in the interest of every democracy to support us now. But I have to say that I'm very grateful to American people. And every time when I see polls or when I talk to people, I see that it's not changing people. This is who American people are. So the support that we have here, from the flag outside to individual sacrifices, to people at the Rotarians or individual people in the small villages who are trying to do their part, or even sending us like postcards and letters, children writing us letters to the embassy. You know, the land of the free and the home of the brave. This is who Americans are, and this is who we are. And even though there are 9,000 or whatever the exact amount of kilometers between us and the ocean, we definitely feel that at this moment, when we fight for our independence, there are so many similarities between us and American people. The entrepreneurship, love to freedom, and our willingness and readiness to fight for it. So we just have to talk to people, and we just have to listen to people also more and explain to those who might not have the knowledge or all the information. And when they see it clearly, then they support us, regardless of what party or what nationality or what race, because this is about dignity and freedom.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those words. And before closing, if I could just make a brief comment in terms of yes, there might be a lot of clamoring from certain sectors in the U.S. political spectrum in terms of cutting off aid for Ukraine or support for Ukraine. But I can tell you, my own organization, Rotary International, we've been around for 110 years. So we've spent billions of dollars through the years on all kinds of causes, including polio eradication. When this war began, we immediately set up a disaster response fund for Ukraine. And within a matter of weeks, we raised $15 million. And since then, we've probably spent close to $40 million on relief efforts for Ukraine. And that's being replicated by civil society organizations throughout the United States, throughout Europe, throughout the world. So I do think, I agree with you, Ambassador, there's a huge groundswell of support for Ukraine for obvious reasons. We're just seeing a country being literally trying to be obliterated back to the Stone Age. So I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic that U.S. support will continue, particularly at the grassroots level, particularly at the level of the American citizen who has it in their heart to really step up in moments like this to help Ukraine. So again, thank you to our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you for our audience here in Washington and to our participants online. And finally, a thanks to the German Marshall Fund and to the Association of Marshall Scholars for hosting us this morning for really great and engaging conversation. Thank you so much.